engagement, which is the end state of many of the things that we want to achieve. This is the case not only in the military, but also in the civilian domain. Training has the advantage that it can be tailored to existing security arrangements, to the interests of both parties, and can almost never be argued against within the framework of existing diplomatic relations. In other words, if you object to training and educating together on each other's points of view, you might as well break your diplomatic relations. For me, it is the diplomatic low-hanging fruit par excellence. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it was a very informative briefing. I found especially interesting these relations with China and those courses for the military, so that really might be interesting. And I could say you might also find the discussions about names within NATO between especially two nations in the southern flank. That is really interesting, even at the highest levels, I would say. Now we will try to establish our transatlantic link with Professor Lorraine Wei from University of North Georgia, and her presentation will be about China's rising influence and the current state of the EU-China strategic partnership, implications for NATO. So, Professor, greetings from Wrocław, from our beautiful city to your beautiful state, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to attend this summit and as a presenter. So my topic is basically about China, EU, and NATO. This is a very broad topic, and I had practiced my presentation and I ran over time, so I try to keep everything within 20 minutes. A little bit about myself. Europe is not my area of specialization. I study East Asian politics, and my research interest focuses on Chinese foreign policy. So my presentation will be mainly about China. Okay, with that, I'm going to share my screen. One moment, please. Okay, so can you see my screen now?
Yes, yes, perfect.
Okay, good, wonderful. This presentation is based on part of my research on Chinese foreign policy. Again, a disclaimer here. I'm not a specialist of European politics nor NATO. So maybe some of the details about Europe or NATO are not so accurate. So if that happens, please let me know. This presentation will primarily about focus on China. Okay, let me see. Oops. Okay, so this is the outline of my presentation. I have divided the presentation, the topic, since it is so broad, China, EU, China partnership, and NATO. So I'm just going to be cover some like 4 parts of this topic. The first, I'm going to talk about Chinese foreign policy position toward alliances in general. The second is China and NATO relations. The third part of my presentation is China-EU strategic partnership, and finally, implications for NATO. Okay, let's begin with China's policy toward alliances. Okay, so traditionally, at least from Chinese foreign policy rhetoric, China practices what is called non-alignment. This means that, according to China, states should not form so-called power blocks that divide the international system or exclude or contain other countries. According to Chinese official position, Chinese Foreign Ministry, this has been reiterated as one of the fundamental principles of Chinese foreign policy. In 1992, China became an observer of the non-aligned movement. So this, again, confirmed China's official foreign policy position towards non-alignment. However, at the same time, it doesn't mean that China does not have any alliances. There is only one treaty ally of China, and currently China has maintained this nominal alliance with North Korea, which is also the DPRK. Earlier this year, 2021, this alliance treaty between China and the DPRK was renewed. So this has confirmed that China is committed to the security and protection of the DPRK. This is the only treaty ally of China. China claims itself to be a strong advocate, according to its official media reports and also the foreign policy documents of the Chinese government. China claims itself to be a strong advocate of the security cooperation model, which features non-alignment, non-confrontation, and non-targeting of any other countries or regions. This means that China is likely going to maintain a position which is a negative attitude and a negative position toward any form of alliances. Will China establish alliances soon? The answer is unknown. With the intensification of the US-China rivalry, that is a possibility, but as of now, as we can see, Chinese officials have still would maintain this principle of non-alignment. Okay, so what does non-alignment mean to the PRC? This means that China does not enter into any alliances, nor will China maintain any alliances, which is not true because China has the treaty ally of the DPRK. Will China join any alliances in the future? The answer is unknown, but it seems that China is working toward that direction. Chinese official position is that China strongly opposes power politics, hegemony, and so-called Cold War mentality. So China sees alliances of the US, so the US's global alliance system, as manifestations of power politics and the US's imperialism and hegemonic power. So how does China see NATO? Since China has this official position toward alliances, of course, China will not perceive NATO in a positive sense. In general, China will see NATO as a policy instrument, as a tool used by the US to maintain its primacy, to maintain the US's global hegemony. Okay. This would apply with other alliances of the US as well. So just NATO, not just NATO, but also US, Japan, US, South Korea alliances. China opposes alliances. At the same time, it also proposes alternative models of security cooperation. An example would be Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And there are also bilateral mechanisms between China and other states, China's partner states in security cooperation. I think China's closest partner to security cooperation is currently Russia, DPRK, and Pakistan. Okay, so China's partners of security cooperation, China is an autocracy, a communist party state, which means that it's unlikely that a security cooperation is maintained between China and the democracy. So China's security partners, there are many security partners, but almost all of them are autocracies or at least hybrid regimes. So that's the first part of my presentation. The second part, I would like to talk a little bit about China-NATO relations. China's past encounters with NATO. Before China's rise, there was little encounter with NATO. So one of the relatively recent incidents was 1999 when the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia was bombed. And I was in China at that time. I come from China, born and raised in China, by the way. So Chinese news, China's official news media made this formulation, quote unquote, US-led NATO bombed Chinese embassy. Although the US's explanation was basically they misidentified the target and it was a mistake, China obviously was not convinced about this explanation. So basically, China saw this case as a great humiliation, and China was insulted because China was weak. China was not strong enough. So China was kind of bullied by the US-led NATO. According to the official discourse, news discourse, there was a nationalist sentiment. Indeed, at that time, 1999, there were nationwide nationalist protests and demonstrations against the US, so rising anti-American sentiments. And China did not particularly blame individual NATO members, but China put the blame primarily on the US. This was the outcome of the US's hegemony. And so this incident basically showed that China was not strong enough. So the rhetoric, the discourse was primarily nationalistic. And China doesn't like NATO. It still doesn't like NATO. Okay. So China's perceptions, of course, China would consider NATO as legacy of Cold War confrontation. There was NATO, there was Warsaw Pact. Instead of seeing NATO as a collective security mechanism, nowadays China still considers NATO as the legacy of the Cold War, and it shouldn't exist. And it is there just to maintain the US's primacy, a pillar of American hegemonism. China's strategies towards NATO, China still wants to avoid any direct confrontation with NATO, and NATO is an alliance, a partnership between the US and allies from Europe, mostly. So there is a geographic difference. So China did not really have this direct encounter with NATO except for 1999, that incident. So China still tries to basically avoid any direct confrontation with NATO. However, as we see, China keeps rising and its global presence is felt in almost every corner of the world. So with the rising US-China rivalry, it's uncertain whether NATO will be concerned, but NATO is already paying attention to China's rise. What I mean is, with China's rise and global presence, China may at some point be on a collision course with NATO because China represents a completely different set of values and a different political system. It's a communist party state. It represents authoritarianism and repression. Okay, so this means that confrontation or tension might be inevitable. China will not work directly to resist NATO, but as I will point out later, so we look at this map here, there is a significant overlap between NATO members and EU members. So basically, we can see that most EU members are also NATO members at the same time. Today, many EU or most EU member states are also trading partners with China. And they have developed economic interdependence with China, but this interdependence is asymmetrical, meaning they depend on China more than China depends on them. This asymmetrical interdependence in economics and trade can lead to sensibilities and vulnerabilities. So in recent years, there have been security concerns regarding Chinese trade with China and Chinese investment. Okay. So going back to this slide, China's strategy will not target NATO specifically, directly, but rather China will work on its relationship with its partnership with EU, and maybe more specifically on the individual basis with EU member states. Okay, so third part of my presentation, China-EU partnership. So this is something that China has been constructing ever since 2003. Let me explain a little bit about comprehensive strategic partnership. So in Chinese foreign policy, there are different formulations to describe the relationships between China and foreign countries. At the very basic level, lowest level, we have friendly cooperation. This basically means the lowest level of bilateral relations. At the highest level, there are different ways of describing a foreign relationship. For example, between China and Pakistan, there was an all-weather partnership, something like that. So between China and the EU, this is a comprehensive strategic partnership, which means that China-EU partnership is about the second highest in the hierarchy in the terms of Chinese foreign policy, second highest. And China pays a lot of attention to developing and strengthening relationship with EU and ties with EU member states. So many observers and analysts have questioned the substance of cooperation. The pillars, as we can see now, is mainly economics and trade. There is also civic engagement. But in recent years, with the US-China rivalry, the civic engagement part has been undermined a bit, mainly because of the security concerns, such as exchange scholars, international students from China, whether they are doing espionage, something like that, and China's these activities of Chinese Communist Party's propaganda department in countries such as Australia. Okay, so civic engagement is basically declining. As of now, the most important pillar has been economics and trade. EU does not like, EU member states do not like this asymmetric interdependence with China. And since 2019, China has been described as a systemic rival. This is in accordance with NATO as the US alliance. And this is also in line with the US's foreign policy position of China is a competitor and also a rival, if not an enemy, if not a potential enemy. So EU has been trying to reduce its economic dependence on China by diversifying trade, by reasserting, criticizing China's horrible human rights record, things like that. So regarding where EU stands between the US and China, EU definitely aligns itself closer to the US than to China, but EU will be unlikely to give up the opportunities offered from China trade and investment between EU and China. So this investment agreement was signed But as far as I know, if I remember correctly, the European Parliament did not approve this, ratify this treaty. So it is still basically this agreement has not taken effect yet. The promising areas still trade and economics, energy cooperation, clean energy, as China is one of the main producers of solar panels, environmental protection, climate change. So these are some promising areas of cooperation between China and the EU. Okay, so this comes to the question, China, EU, and US EU, does the EU have to choose a side? Not long ago, I watched a documentary about Chinese investments in Europe, in specific European countries like Italy and Greece. So Chinese investments have helped revive the local economy. So to some extent, these EU member states welcome Chinese investments. However, overall, EU as an entity upholds free market, human rights, and Western values, liberal democratic values. That's what China is not. So basically, EU is kind of in between. And this situation is similar to ASEAN's position with regard to China. Of course, it's also different because ASEAN has a geographic proximity with China, and they are more disinclined to take a side than the EU. Okay. How might the EU benefit from cooperation with China and the US? So it depends on multiple factors. So there are relative power concerns. I think whether individual allies of the US, whether they will align themselves closely with the US, it depends on multiple factors, like the relative power of US vis-a-vis China, and also the US's ability and willingness to realize the commitments. And also the third thing would be, according to my observation, how tempting China's terms and conditions are, how much China can offer. So these are the factors to consider. If an ally sees that US is rapidly declining while China is on the rise, and the US is unwilling to keep its promises, then they are more likely going to practice what is called strategic hedging. As we see in East Asia, Southeast Asia, lots of states are hedging states. Whether EU is hedging, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on EU, but I think that with NATO, EU is closely aligned with the US. However, as we can see in economics and trade, EU member states like Germany enjoys a trade surplus with China. So such EU members, they are more willing to maintain friendly ties with China. And while at the same time, they will also remain security allies to the US. Institutions, some optimists, especially international relations liberals, they tend to see that if China can be engaged in international institutions, China can be expected to be can be expected to abide by the rules. So China will unlikely be a revisionist state, but that's an optimistic view. How much international institutions can transform China and change China's intentions? That's a question with many answers. That's a debatable question. From an identity perspective, EU and the US obviously share a lot of common identities and interests. One of the most prominent things would be democratic values, human rights, democracy, civil rights and liberties, free market. So China has clearly, rule of law, China has clearly rejected these values, meaning that China has put itself on the opposite side of the US and EU. Okay, so with trade, EU seems to be so divided. Some EU member states would still want more cooperation with China, whereas others have become more skeptical and they have they have approached China more like they have seen China more like an enemy or a rival. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about China's strengths and vulnerabilities. So the major strengths, China-EU partnership, is the economic leverage. Obviously, China has been using its economic leverage to obtain political favors. For example, one of the conditions to enter into a free trade agreement with China would be to recognize China as a full market economy. And in order to cooperate with China on a comprehensive basis, Taiwan has to be recognized according to the CCP's terms, which is Taiwan is a province of China. It's not a sovereign state. So China has been using its economic power a lot to gain political favors. And of course, this comes at the expense of Taiwan's interests. Vulnerabilities from my research on Chinese domestic politics, I'll keep it brief. So under Xi Jinping, there has been a turn toward the left, meaning there is a bigger government, more repression, more censorship, and more social control. AI has been used to monitor citizens' activities, and there is a social credit system. There is more concentration of power. So even with China's economic rise, China obviously has not turned toward democratization, but rather China is going toward the opposite direction. Recently, the US has launched a diplomatic boycott against the Winter Olympics in Beijing because of China's human rights records. And many states have answered this call, like Australia, like France. So this has basically made China more aware that how it is different from this rule-based international system. And if it doesn't change, if it doesn't want to change, it will become more isolated. And the more isolated China becomes, the more disapproval it will get from the outside world. So that's like a vicious cycle. And within China, there is rising nationalism. China is the best. China should not be criticized, and China has been demonized by the so-called Western media and those Western scholars. So there has been a lot of discourse about this. Even with China's economic leverage, we don't know how long China's economic power will last, or how far China can go. China is trying to transform its national economy from export-driven, labor-intensive growth to more like innovation-driven growth. And this is in the campaign of Made in China 2025. However, China's economy has been slowing down. Obviously, one of the reasons, COVID. That you have got to abide by the party's terms and conditions. If you want more power and influence, if you seek to question the party's authority and monopoly of power, you put yourself into trouble. So Xi has made it very clear to the entrepreneurs that China is going to maintain its socialist nature. China is a socialist state. So these entrepreneurs can only act within the parameters allowed by the CCP. Otherwise, if they criticize the party, they will cease to exist. Okay, so with this domestic environment, China's economy, invention, we don't know. There has been restricted information. So with a lot of censorship, how can you expect innovation and new ideas to emerge? So it's open to question, basically, whether China will realize the innovation-driven growth, and maybe under corporativism, the government will take the role to organize inventions and innovation and something like that. Okay, so but that will be led by the Chinese government rather than the free market. Okay, last part of my presentation. Okay, so NATO's response to China's rise obviously, NATO has paid more attention to China, and China is a potential threat, but China is not an enemy yet. As China's global presence is more noticeable, there are issues of trade and security, non-traditional security like cyber security. China has caused cyber security concerns. Human rights, one of the most important areas. China has one of among the worst countries with human rights records. Okay, so NATO stands for Western liberal democratic values. So NATO is here to defend these values, meaning that those autocratic states like China and Russia, NATO will resist their influence, and NATO will take action to not really to contain China, but to resist this spread of authoritarianism. Okay, possible options of NATO. This is again based on my research of Chinese foreign policy, and it is not like I don't know much about NATO, so I'm thinking about possible options. One of the things that has been talked about by the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C., in the U.S., is the Meta West. They have organized a series of webinars specifically covering different aspects of Meta West. And they have a YouTube channel, so you can find those webinars on their YouTube channel, Foreign Policy Research Institute, FPRI. So the Meta West is basically, NATO would be the core of the US's partnership. And then under the Meta West, there will be closer partnerships with, among different US allies. So like Japan and South Korea, they have accepted Western values, so they are part of the Meta West. And under this term, different US allies can cooperate. They can strengthen their partnerships. Not just security, but also anything can be related to security nowadays. So it's a wide range of issues, not just specifically conventional security. Minilateralism, that's what I was thinking. This is basically individual NATO members would reach out across the continent to take action about to watch closely situations in the Indo-Pacific region. So what I'm talking about is minilateralism is particular NATO members can seek to establish partnerships and security cooperation mechanisms to individual US allies in the Indo-Pacific. One of the most recent examples is AUKUS, UK, US, and Australia. Of course, it was proposed by Australia, but this AUKUS is a formal treaty alliance, and it includes two NATO allies, US and UK. So minilateralism means some NATO members will establish the informal security cooperation dialogues and mechanisms and arrangements between themselves and also US's allies in the Indo-Pacific. I'm not sure if NATO has a policy study group or committee with a focus on China, but I think with China's rise, NATO might have such an organization established. US administrations, so the US's attitude is obviously essential. In the Trump administration, there was a transactional approach, which has been widely considered as has undermined US's global alliance network. Under the Biden administration, the US has reaffirmed its commitment to the allies. So basically, this is trust building. This is, again, engagement and cooperation. Okay, so some final thoughts with regard to defense budget. Yesterday, I read about a piece of news. Basically, it was the US defense budget bill. It's being debated in the US Congress. So with the threat from China and Russia, and perhaps DPRK as well, the US is going to increase its defense budget year by year. And this is not just specifically military thing, it's also about technology. So with with NATO, it's also essential that technological cooperation, like development of autonomous weapons, like science and technology, this will be a major part for NATO to develop. And then there is the strategic importance of outer space. China and Russia, especially China, has been so aggressive in exploring outer space for scientific purposes, also for strategic purposes. So the US established an outer space force back in 2019. And this can be, and basically NATO can contemplate also cooperating with the US and other US allies on the outer space force, outer space strategic cooperation. Okay, so finally, it depends on how security versus insecurity is defined. And basically, it concerns like whose security, what types of security. Security is multidimensional and comprehensive, so security is everywhere. Any issue can be a security issue. So definition of security, a broader definition would lead to comprehensive cooperation. Security threats, what are those threats? So China's rapid rise and China as an autocracy basically means China is a threat. And the DPRK, which is developing a nuclear program, is also a security threat. But threats do not just come from sovereign states. Threats also take other forms like terrorist groups, like hackers. So threats can arise from anywhere. Okay, I have run over time, and thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you find my presentation helpful.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wei. It was really meaningful and very insightful presentation about China. We were speaking this morning about NATO perspective, and the China was mentioned for the first time 2 years ago as a potential threat to NATO. But do you have any questions to Dr. Wei, since we have this link? Please, Dirk.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Wei. My question is about the Belt and Road Initiative, and especially some of the military aspects, the establishment of a naval base in Africa. How do you see this initiative in the light of security cooperation or security competition between China and the West?
That's a good question. So as far as I know, China has several overseas military bases already, and one of them is in Djibouti in Africa. China's official discourse is that this is to protect Chinese commercial ships, and it has nothing to do with China's pursuit of hegemony. So China has grown into a global power, and its military technology, its military power still lags behind the US and NATO for in terms of decades, but China is rapidly catching up. So that's why China has caused so much concern from NATO. And in the future, if China's economy continues to grow, it's likely that China is going to establish more military bases. So that means that China and the US will be more in a competitive position and more rivalry, more competition. So with the BRI, I think the BRI is only partially successful. From what I have read from my research, many states are, especially the developing states, they are unable to pay back China. So China offers those loans that with very tempting terms, long repayment periods, low interest or even no interest. But eventually China wants the money to be paid back. What if a developing country cannot pay back China's loans? And then China will offer China will propose some solutions, which is basically to push that developing country who owes money to China to support China politically, such as rejecting Taiwan as an independent state, such as maintain investment, protection of investment of China, and keep their economic partnership with China going on, using Chinese technology, things like that. So China will have different political conditions. So some US officials have described that China's BRI is basically setting traps for those developing countries and for all the partners, actually. So when they are trapped, China still wants the money back, but money is not the main issue. What China wants is political favors.
Thank you. Please.
Pact and all the other allies will respond. So I was thinking, in the case of Taiwan, if the US has committed itself to the protection of Taiwan, so a scenario that NATO might join in a direct confrontation with China would be the Taiwan Strait. If the US joins gets into conflict with China, and then NATO will respond. So NATO, in my view, NATO is not constrained by the geographic location, but NATO can be really can have global actions.
Dr. Wei and really all the panelists, thank you so much for a very insightful panel today. I had a comment and a question for Dr. Wei and another question for the rest of the panelists, if I may as well. The comment would go as following. China is currently exporting over 80% of its new technologies, including drones, to BRI members. So one could claim that the BRI is in fact acting as some sort of a technological transfer belt for China. So if China is building military bases abroad to protect its commercial interests, are we likely to see this kind of protectionist approach moving forward when it comes to the exploitation of new and advanced technologies? I'm not talking just about the sale of these technologies. I'm also talking about approaching them from the point of view of establishing standards in international bodies and using its leverage with these countries, with these customer countries, to gain more leverage in international organizations to set these standards in ways that are favorable to Beijing. And my comment was actually about China's approach to NATO. And it seems to me that it's a bit opportunistic as well, because if we remember the times of the AFPAC strategy, I know that that's long forgotten now, but at some point during the AFPAC strategy, we were seriously considering closer cooperation with China, including exploring China-NATO dialogue. And there was a time when, for very practical and pragmatic reasons, China was open to it. It just didn't want to have the handshake on TV to show for, because it just didn't, it didn't match with its stated policy. So might we envisage some sort of a similar scenario moving forward, where the political narrative in Beijing is in fact limiting China's options in relation to engaging with NATO, but also with other alliances as well? And if I may also mention that I understand the non-alignment policy of China, but this also only applies to formal alliances, not groupings of states that in fact act as alliances for China, but are not necessarily recognized as such in military terms. And then, if I may, a question for the rest of the panelists, because I found it absolutely fascinating, and I think that education is such a critical aspect of innovation. I was just wondering whether, in relation between military education systems and civilian ones, and also in relation to the European Security and Defense College, whether defense innovation is considered or should be considered to be taught as a discipline in itself. Should we consider, investing and teaching and training our future troops, but also our policymakers and our staffers in what it means to be entrepreneurial in terms of defense innovation and the integration of emerging and disruptive technologies? Thank you.
Dr. Wei, please.
I'm going to talk briefly about China's technological exports. The BRI, yes, China has been exporting its technology like Huawei, like a 5G network. So I've read articles about China's cooperation with African countries, China's activities on the African continent. Basically, China exports technologies a lot. And then when an African country has adopted Chinese technology, they become dependent upon it. So they will have to rely on Chinese technology for basically everything. And China has been actively building the mobile phone network and internet connection and various types of telecommunications and technology there on the African continent. And Chinese technology can be addictive. So once you use Chinese technology, you have to keep using it. And it has a state has to abide by Chinese terms and conditions, especially those politically sensitive issues like Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong. So basically, this is, again, China, an example that China is using its economic leverage for political gains. And China will set up more and more overseas military bases. And I think to the domestic audience, the Chinese mainstream media, which are controlled by the government, obviously. So Chinese mainstream media will say this is peace. This is for peacekeeping. This is to protect Chinese citizens and commercial interests. So China will not see this the expanding number of military bases as hegemony, as pursuit of hegemony, but rather it will frame it as like protection of citizens, for peace. So with that, I think China and NATO like a pretty tense relationship. And China's approach to NATO, I'm not sure China really cooperated with NATO or wanted to cooperate with NATO. I'm not sure about that. So I need to do more research about it. So as far as I know, China is like cooperating with perhaps like EU. So many EU members are NATO members at the same time, but China will not directly approach NATO because of its non-alignment policy, but rather China will cooperate with individual NATO states, also individual EU members. Yeah, I think that's my comment for now.
Thank you. Gentlemen, your answer, please, Dirk.
Yes, thank you for the question. Indeed, a very good question. Should we teach our future civilian and military elites on topics such as defense innovation? I think we already do, actually, and depending on the member state of the EU, up to a certain degree, in the past. France, for example, has always taken this approach. They have always integrated in their training system the cooperation with the big armaments companies, specifically in France. And this is an example that we at the ESDC have taken as well. And the first course in which we actively engaged in that regard was the EDA's armaments cooperation course that was offered to us. And we still go on in that way today. However, I should also underline that contrary to what Darius had told us, in some member states, the military academies do have a fundamental research capability that is quite independent and actually financed, in the case of the Belgian Military Academy, quite well through participation in EU programs. Just to give you one example, the Belgian Military Academy is researching the antennas to transmit the containment field in the ITER program, so in the nuclear fusion program in France. So they do have that research capability, and they work very closely with that with civilian universities, the ULB as one example, where we work very closely on that. And also in that regard, we have now started at the ESDC more recently this doctoral school program, which focuses on common security and defense policy research and promoting that with academies. So the answer to your question is yes, we should do it. We should probably do it even more. We should convince our leaders and our future leaders of the importance of defense innovation, both in the terms of policy and in terms of hard scientific research as well. Thank you.
So thank you, Simona, for that question. For me, it's crucial. I completely agree, and let me add. So I was a Chief of Strategy and Geostrategy Chair in the National Defense University, and I gave and led plenty of the strategy courses in the Arabic states, in the Canada, of course, in the NATO Defense College Rome, in the BD College, etc. But your question is, if we are talking about the innovation in education, we are talking about the modern product, I think. And let's see that problem from the political strategic level, because I completely agree. Concerning the military aspects, of course, we have a good academies and we could cooperate closer, yes. But if we are talking about the, let me say, new value, we need new strategy. If we need new strategy, I'm sorry, let's say my opinion concerning our strategies. We have a strategies for the past. We don't have currently strategy for the future. In my opinion, as a strategic personnel, I have prepared Polish National Defense Strategy for 2014. We are talking about the middle and long distance strategy. I'm thinking about the 10, 20, 30 years ahead. I'm not thinking about the short stage of strategy. I'm thinking about the 2, 3 to 7 years. No. And we need modern, innovated educational process. We need the closer cooperation. And of course, we have been organizing, you know, in the NATO Defense College and in the others institutions, École de Guerre in Paris, and the others I organized in the National Defense University in Warsaw, international courses, but we will have to receive the synergy effect. We need to prepare the next generation of decision makers. I'm not thinking about the civilian personnel. It was the main point of my speech. I tried to explain. We have to cooperate not only the institutional, but the mental way of thinking about the security and strategy. I completely agree with our colleagues from the University of Georgia. Yes, as a relation between the NATO and China and NATO and Russia, it's an excellent example that if we want to be the winner in the strategic point of view, we have to take into consideration the good concept of strategy, our idea for the next decades, not for only the nearest 4 years. I'm thinking about the election time in each of country. Sometimes we are thinking about the Western society, about more about election and less about the next decades. The answer is that probably we will have to change, and we'll have to firstly create and later put the new products concerning the political, strategic, educational level for the security, let me say, of the Western democratic societies, not from the European point of view. I think that we have to collect the all partners who want to support us against no democratic powers. It doesn't work currently. We have been concentrating for our institutions and our organizations, but could you see it was an excellent example for the speeches from our colleague as an ambassador and from the University of Georgia, that China and Russia, they have an idea and strategies for the supporting and collecting the all partners who want to act against us, against the Western societies. We have to prepare the new generation of the personnel, but especially strategic personnel branches, to prepare, let me say, realistic, let me stress again, realistic cooperation and realistic strategic cooperation, and we have to use as a tools our educational institutions, civilian and military. But firstly, we have to cooperate closer. Secondly, we have to create altogether new strategy, not military, not civilian, new strategy for us for the maybe 2, maybe 3 decades. It's the shortest time. And let's update the strategy after each big strategic challenge. Could you see for the COVID threats? To tell you the truth, we didn't update our strategies because of that in the political, economical, cultural, social, and let me add, military aspects. So it's my point. Thank you for that question. The answer is yes. Innovation in education, it's a new value, and let's try to create the synergy effect in the political strategic level, because in the operational and tactical, it's easier. But if we want to be the winner of that strategic game, we have to think in the political strategic point of view. In the other way, we will prepare ourselves to the former conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have space for one question? Yes. I mean, the last one. The last one, please.
Okay, Joe Burton, University Libre de Bruxelles. I think it's been a really fascinating panel, and a comment on China. There's sort of an interesting intersection between the talk on China and the talk on universities, because I think sort of the presence of China in Western universities as an educator myself is of increasing concern. We're seeing, of course, universities being targeted for intellectual property theft. I've got students in my classroom who are clearly self-censoring what they say because they are afraid of being reported on to Chinese authorities or by their peers. Or I'm seeing students come from China to university who really are kind of repeating PRC talking points, particularly around issues like Xinjiang, in their research papers. And this, I think, presents really quite fundamental challenges to us as educators, when we're also, as universities, so reliant on the foreign income and the fees that Chinese students are generating. So I think there are some really big ethical concerns around this for universities. I'd note in this context that my own university, University Libre de Bruxelles, recently shut down its Confucius Institute because of fears of espionage. So I think there's a whole host of issues that we need to grapple with here, and I thank Dr. Wei for being so sort of up front and straightforward about some of the views and perceptions of China of NATO, which I think is really important. So that was my comment, and I'll keep the question brief, which was for colleagues from the educational institutes. My own research looks at the formation of strategic culture at an EU level in Europe, and this is quite a big priority for the EU at the moment. I'm wondering how you see the role of the ESDC and other military and professional educational academies in forging a common EU strategic culture. Because strategic culture really to me is about common ideas, threat perceptions, beliefs, etc. How are you going about that? Is this something you're conscious of and taking forward in the work you're doing? Thank you very much.
Do we have 2 hours?
No.
Okay, seriously. An excellent question, and if you would read the original joint action of 2005 establishing the ESDC, that was already at that time the first objective given to the European Security and Defence College to promote the establishment of a security culture within the European Union. This is something that the first chairman of our executive academic board was at that time director of the EU ISS, Nicole Gnesotto. She gave an excellent definition of what the security culture was, and you can find it on the internet quite easy. But I always translate it. What is this security culture? It's trying to explain to somebody from the Baltic states, our good ambassador over there, that there are actually other enemies or other competitors than Russia, and that we also actually have interests, for instance, in Africa. And at the same time, explaining to the friends from the Iberian Peninsula that, well, there's not only the migration issue from Africa and our former colonies over there, but there are actually also challenges in the Middle East and North Africa and to the eastern flank. So that is trying to create this, this elusive security culture. Are we successful in that? Well, I've been working with the college since 2007 with a short interruption back in the Belgian Ministry of Defense. I think we have come quite a long way, and you can see that in the policy documents, reflected in the policy documents. I think there is today a better understanding that the interests of the European Union are not the smallest common denominator of the member states' interests, but it's not the sum of all the interests either. Neither should it actually be. So it is something more than the smallest common denominator. We're working on it. It's important. One of the main things I think I feel as one of the biggest added values of the European Security and Defence College is the fact that we not only do that with the military, we do that with the civilian, bringing together the both aspects within the two. There is, however, a limitation built in the EU treaty, that is that the Commission cannot finance anything that leads to military capability development. And actually under the Juncker's Commission, for the first time that was broken up to a certain extent, where we can now do research and development on military capabilities up to the creation of a working prototype. That was new. When I started in the college in 2007 and was working on military Erasmus in 2008, we couldn't even call military Erasmus, because the guy from the Commission was objecting to that, and we had to call it the European Initiative for the Exchange of Young Officers inspired by Erasmus. That was a very long discussion. So the short answer to your question, we're working on it. Could it be better? Yes, we still have a lot of work on it. It's still in the most recent version of my council decision of last year. It's still there as one of my first objectives, and I think we have come a long way. In the compass, there is a lot of new ground being covered that points in that direction. Thank you.
Shortly, Mr. Chairman, 2 minutes only. 2 minutes only. So, concerning the answer for your question, for your comment, so it's a crucial. If we are talking about the, let me say, educational strategy culture, I'd like to stress that we have a lesson learned. We have a very difficult lecture from the I took part a few times in Afghanistan, 2 times in Iraq, in the Middle East, 2 times in Balkans. I made the unique field research in the spaces of that. I'm not talking about the theory. And I'd like to stress that we have a lesson learned, very heavy lecture, we as a NATO, and we as a Western societies, from the theaters of operation. And if we want to create the new product, as Simona asked us, I'm thinking about that innovation of educational process, we can check that, how it's working, in the realistic situations. And I want to give the question, do we receive and do we take into consideration the lecture from the Afghanistan, from the other theaters of operation? Do we take that into consideration? Could you see currently for our activity in the Balkans, for our activity in the Middle East, I'm thinking about the EU, NATO and Western, let me say, policy and societies. Could you see for the policy of Russia in that regions? Could you see for the policy of the China in the Middle Asia, Central Asia? And of course, if we are talking about the education and the new products, I try to explain that. We are not talking about the theory. We are not talking about the curriculums, seminars, summits, and conferences. We are talking about the realistic success of activity in the strategic point of view. No current operations, but we are talking about the future, about the, as you said, about the leaders. I mean, we don't need, common military and common culture and common political, let me say, organization culture. We need political, military, and the other, with comprehensive culture for the mutual cooperation. In the other way, we will have more threats than strategic chances. I wish us that let's use the strategic chances. Let's avoid the strategic threats in the strategic thinking. So, thank you very much. 2.5 minutes. I'm very sorry.
Thank you, Dariusz. To conclude,
I'd like to bring to your attention that one of the participants has asked some excellent questions in the chat. So I would like to answer them real quick. This is a 3-part question. The first, how do you see the actual Chinese strategy about autonomous weapons? So this is not my area of specialization, but in general, China's military technology, it is driven by nationalism. So basically, China wants to promote made in China weapons, of course, and it wants to reduce its dependence on the imports of weapons, mainly from Russia. So the more China sees the world, outside world, as hostile, as against China, the more likely China is going to focus on developing advanced weapons. So this is driven by nationalism and threat perception. And the second, do you think they will support a multilateral ban on those weapons systems? I'm not sure. I don't think that China would support a multilateral ban on autonomous weapons. And one thing is, from a constructivist perspective, there is distrust between China and Western countries, such as NATO members. So basically, China would see that any attempt to put a ban or to sign a treaty to restrict the development of these high-tech weapons would be mainly a constraint upon China. It's something imposed on China to prevent China from developing its military power. So it's more like, again, a manifestation of Western imperialism. But in the diplomatic sense, if China wants to improve its international image, it might seek multilateral cooperation. So it means that it's also possible that China might support a multilateral ban. But for its own national interests, as China sees the world as more hostile, less friendly, and the US being the major culprit of imperialism. So China will focus more on developing those weapons. And even though there is ban on use, transfer, things like that, China may still not support the research and development of those weapons. Third and last, and I'm sorry for speaking for so long, couldn't a common treaty build more trust among NATO and China in order to not trample in a bloc confrontation? So I think from a constructivist perspective, it depends on the definition of security and security threats, whether China and NATO may come to develop common interests in security. So as of now, obviously NATO is US alliance, part of the US global alliance system. So common identities and interests, no. Maybe like counterterrorism, things like that. But still, China's definition of terrorist activities would be very different from Western definition. China would identify the Uyghurs as potential terrorists. However, the Western countries would disagree. So it depends on the common treaty. I would see a common treaty would be like basically depends on the common interest. So if there is no agreement on the definition of security and no common interest in areas of security, then this treaty will be very difficult. So just to briefly answer these questions.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all panelists. Maybe to conclude, we are discussing mainly academic issues, but we are always ending up in the word political. So we need more statesmen, I believe. That's what Professor Kozarawski said. And not to think about next elections. So we need political strategies which are valid. We need this political consensus at NATO, at EU as well. And that's a challenge, as indicated, we have this 360 degrees threat. And just to conclude, Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping don't have to think about elections. So that's their advantage. So with this, we will have lunch break, I believe. And I was told that the next session will resume at 3 o'clock sharp. Thank you so much. Thank you. See you with different moderators and wish you good discussion. Thank you.